Hello, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to Satsang. Satsang is an ancient spiritual practice from India. It means being in reality together. I give Satsang live every Wednesday and Sunday night in Portland, Maine. This Dharma talk was recorded during one of our Wednesday night gatherings. Please visit jayakula.org to learn more about the teachings. You can find video satsangs on Jayakula's YouTube channel, and my books are all available on Amazon.com. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. When I'm teaching, everyone hears me say the word practice a lot. When you're doing practice or your practice or something like that. And then, people who are relatively new will eventually, depending on how long and how they've been around and how shy they are, will eventually go, what do you mean by practice?
What do you mean by practice?
Yeah. So tonight we're going to talk about what practice means in this tradition, the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism or classical Tantra. Well, first of all, let me say that in the history of India, in the religious history of India, the kind of most common story that you hear about Tantra is that it's somehow not only oppositional to mainstream Hinduism, and by the way, for those of you that are new, Hinduism is actually a word that was made up by British colonials. And there really isn't any such thing as Hinduism. The various traditions of India are highly decentralized. So the tradition, what we could loosely term Hinduism is actually in India called the Sanatana Dharma, which means the eternal way. And there are traditions. For instance, the tradition of Tantra, the tradition of Vedanta, the tradition of Jainism, the tradition of Advaita Vedanta, the tradition of Sri Vidya. There are these big traditions. And none of them have headquarters or popes or anything like that. Right? What they have are lineages. So lineages are successions of teachers who receive teachings from their preceptors, aka their gurus, and then eventually go off and teach on their own, and then confer that lineage on somebody else. So that's one form of organization. There are like a million different streams. So within any particular tradition, you might have a lot of subdivisions. Even the tradition of Tantra is huge and has a lot of different subdivisions and thousands of lineages that are basically successions of people who hold the teachings. And what it means to hold the teachings is to have received them, digested them, practiced them, and realized the fruit of those practices. And when you realize the fruit of practice, when you when you embody that practice, then you're able to give it to somebody else and have that other person be able to practice it in a good way. Then there are also, of course, people who teach outside of lineages. Who God knows how many, thousands of people that, or tens of thousands of people that is. So it's just a highly decentralized scene in terms of what spiritual life looks like in India. And within that scene, and of course there's also Christians in India, lots of Christians. There's all kind, everything is there. In terms of the word Hinduism, because India is very different from our culture. Our culture tends to reject foreign things. Indian culture tends to assimilate foreign things. So for instance, in Indian culture, Jesus Christ is considered to be an avatar of Vishnu. Why not? And there are many teachers, especially in the Kriya Yoga lineages that come from Lahiri Mahasaya Yogananda. In those lineages especially, they're kind of worshiping Christ and Indian gurus side by side. They don't mind. It's not a conflict for them. And the same with like astrology. Somewhere back in the day along the Silk Road, Greek and Roman astrologers met Vedic astrologers. Of course, the Vedic system's much older, but what happened? The Greek and Roman astrologers didn't assimilate Indian astrology. The Indian astrology, which already had 27 constellations of its own, different from the 12 constellations we work with, said, hey, we'll take 12 more. No problem. We can handle that. So there's a story about Tantra, about classical Tantra, that it's kind of fringe. This is a story today that circulates in India and abroad. And that it's a fringe tradition, and that it's oppositional to something called mainstream spiritual practice in India. Well, the oppositional part is partially true. For sure, the historical roots or the historical culture of authentic Tantra, of classical Tantra, was in part a response to the fact that the upper crusties, the Brahmin class, the priest class, wouldn't let ordinary people practice ritual or get initiated into certain mantras, and was sort of holding cultural power by refusing to let certain people practice more of the mainstream tradition. And so in the whole culture of Tantra as it grew up had at its heart an egalitarianism. This idea that anybody could practice. It didn't matter what class or caste you came from, didn't matter what gender you came from. So all of the divisions in Indian society were challenged by Tantra, by classical Tantra. That being said, it's very important to realize that almost all of the actual practices, like mantra, puja, working with yantras, kriya yoga, pranayama, hatha yoga, all came out of tantric traditions. So for instance, I was a teacher at Northwestern University, and one of the students there was from Maharashtra in India. And her parents were very upper crusty and very, snooty. They were just snooty. And and they had what's very common in India, they had a family guru, someone that just sort of was the preceptor for the whole family. And this person initiated people and taught people Kriya Yoga, which is working with the channels, and gave people pranayama, and absolutely railed against Tantra. Tantra was evil incarnate, and yet every single thing this teacher was practicing came out of the Tantric tradition. Interesting. That's very common. Now, it's much more easy to understand when you understand what's actually the case, which is that Tantra is not a fringe tradition. Yes, it's oppositional in some of its views to the prejudices and divisions of more mainstream Hindu spiritual culture. But it is by far from fringe. And in fact, it is, as has been more recently argued by various scholars of the tradition, it actually is the indigenous practice of India, the indigenous spiritual tradition, the most widespread. So this is a really different story that's now emerging after a lot of decades of telling a very different kind of a story about Tantra. And I think the proof is in the fact that everyone in India practices Tantra just about, unless they're Christian. Something they're doing in their spiritual life came from the Tantric tradition. When I say everybody is practicing Tantra, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek. Because as I'm going to say in a few minutes, the tradition that you're practicing in is not based on the practice that you're doing. I'll explain that. you can do mantra, and you can do pranayama, and you can do kriya yoga, and you can do hatha yoga with entirely different orientations, right? You can do a practice like mantra with the idea, the concept that you are trying to get rid of your human body and become a god. If you're doing a practice that way, you are not practicing Tantra, even though you might be reciting a Tantric mantra. So the view with which you're practicing, or what we call the bhava, the feeling orientation with which you're practicing, is actually the tradition. Because practices in and of themselves can be done with extremely different views or bhavas and bring about entirely different results. We know this because a person who goes to 24-hour fitness and takes a yoga class with disco music playing and an instructor wearing, one of those things, blaring at them, and with the intention that I just want to get fit, is just going to get fit. That's going to be the result, right? They're going to get the result that they want. A person who does the same asana with different instruction and with a different bhava and with a different intention is going to have an entirely different experience and a different result. So it isn't just the practice that makes the tradition. It's how you do the practice. And this is why my teachers have always taught, and I also teach, that the view teachings, the teachings that orient you to the literal practice, like mantra or pranayama, are the most important teachings that you get. And the view teachings are the teachings that orient you, that tell you how to think about the practice, what intention to have, how to orient yourself. Those teachings are why you need a teacher. Because if let's say you hear a mantra somewhere, or you go to a yoga studio and someone says a mantra and you decide you like it, or you hear one on a CD, or you go to an amma, the hugging saint, and she whispers a mantra in your ear, but there's no instruction. All you get is the mantra. What's going to happen when you sit down to do the mantra? All of the received ideas that you have about spirituality are going to inform your attitude toward that mantra and how you practice it. Maybe you come from a Christian or a Jewish tradition. And so those things that are swirling around in there are going to have some impact on how you do that practice. Maybe you think doing the mantra is going to save you from yourself. Maybe you think it's going to help you transcend the muck of this world. Maybe you think it's just to calm you down. Maybe you have no idea why you're doing it, but you just like it. Which is actually the best attitude possible if you have no instruction. But when we don't have coherent view teachings, then we just fill in the gaps, right? And we get whatever result that we get based on the view that we're practicing with. So this is why it's said, and it's true, that view teachings are the most important teachings. View. View. They're called view teachings, but it means like the orientation to the practice, right? How should you orient yourself when you sit down to do a certain practice? I've already mentioned, what are some of the literal practices of the Tantric tradition, like mantra, like puja, ritual worship, hatha yoga, kriya yoga, what else? Practicing with sacred geometry, yantra, doing practices with especially what's called the sandhi, S-A-N-D-H-I. These are gaps where one thing is turning into another. This is very much associated with the Tantric tradition, like the gap between the in-breath and the out-breath and the out-breath and the in-breath. These things are very typical or sort of the essence in Tantric practice. The actual key to all Tantric practice and realization is what's called Guru Yoga. Guru Yoga means that you are recognizing that your essence nature is the same as the Guru's. And you're practicing with that. And there are many ways to do that, to do Guru Yoga, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm just mentioning it because it's really at the heart of the tradition. And that's why working one-on-one with a teacher is considered to be so important in this tradition. There really is, people here like to think, oh, I can do this myself, or my spiritual community is my guru, or nature is my guru, or, all that stuff could be true if you're already highly realized. But most people are just practicing spiritual bypassing when they're saying that kind of thing. Or they're just naive. They just don't know. They're, kind of honestly naive. So, in the tradition, there really is no tantric practice without a teacher until people are very, very advanced. It just, in terms of if you want to talk about what is the tradition is working with a teacher. And that's just the way that it is. It's like a car is a car, it's not an orange. Sometimes people try to argue, well, but this, but that. Traditions have characteristics. They have things that actually make them that tradition, and working with a teacher is, in Tantra, the main thing that makes it Tantra. And that's true in all of the direct realization traditions like Dzogchen and Chan Buddhism also, where there's a much heavier emphasis on working with a teacher, because through that you can get a taste or a glimpse of your own essence nature and begin working with that. That's the actual directness. So I call this direct realization Tantra. The official academic name is Kashmir Shaivism. But I think that direct realization actually speaks more to what the tradition is really about. It's about some things happen in the alchemy of your practice, the alchemy of your work with the teacher, and you directly recognize your own enlightened nature. And then you work with that. You work on making that your home base. Right? Even, in the Tantras, I didn't make this idea of direct realization up. This is a phrase that's in the ancient scriptures called the Tantras. And even Ma talks about direct realization. So this is actually really the pith of the tradition as far as I'm concerned. Did you have, or are you just scratching? Okay. So...
Well, actually, I do have a question. So the Tantras are a text, but how people view Tantra as this sort of outsider thing is different than, like, do some of the Hindu traditions rise from those Tantric texts?
Well, there's different series of texts, scripture or shastra in India, and there's different kinds of Tantras. So some of them are... there's dialogic, and they're dialogues between some form of Shiva and some form of Shakti. And sometimes Shiva is asking the questions to Shakti, and sometimes Shakti is asking the questions to Shiva. Then there are also texts called the Puranas, which are more like storytelling. So for instance, the Tripura Rahasya that we read in the Samhita is one of those Puranas. Right? It's teachings, but it's in the form of narrative stories. Those are the basic kinds of tantric texts. Tantra is a word that was used to refer to the texts of the tradition, but that's not its only meaning. Yeah. So the word itself also refers to continuity and to expand the mind. So the expansion of the mind aspect, it doesn't mean that you expand your own individual mind. It means that you release your sense of enclosed individuality, and your mind just pours into the mind of God. And you realize that there's only one mind of God. That's what to expand the mind meaning of the word Tantra is. Sure.
You referred again to Hinduism, but there is no Hinduism.
Well, I got into the assimilation thing. I didn't actually finish making my point. Was because now, of course, lots of people in India use the word Hinduism.
And that's kind of a larger term for religious practices.
That aren't Christian or Jewish.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you're saying also that there's something outside of that people consider to be Tantra that's...
Yes. Yeah, so you'll hear people have a lot of ideas about Tantra in India, that it's black magic, that, which, there are some Tantras that are spell books, ritual mantras to make things happen in the world. Every now and then, a few times a year, I get an email from somebody in India saying, can you give me a mantra to get my girlfriend back? Or can you give me a mantra to kill my neighbor? Or, something like that. Seriously. But people who practice sorcery are not practicing classical Tantra. As I said, there's lots of Tantras in India too. It's not just one thing. Even the Tantra of Kashmir Shaivism is an amalgam or a synthesis of 5 or 6 different Tantric lineages that were around at the time between the 10th and the 11th century. So it's complicated, right? Yeah. Yeah. This is why I always joke around that when I first found out that what I was practicing was Tantra, I tried to learn about India and I tried to learn about Tantra, and my experience was I was like on one of those outward bound things where they drop you in the wilderness with like a paper clip and a fish hook, a paper clip and a box of matches. I was like, it was so big and so complicated. It is overwhelming when we're used to everything being in these neat little lines, right? And we got the Pope and his Pope-mobile. Yeah, exactly. It's very, very different. There's an interesting history of the city of Varanasi, which is Kashi, that it's been, this is actually the truth, that it's been sacked by the Muslims 7 times. The city's been razed, and there's hardly any of the old city left standing. But the Muslims were trying to stamp out Hindu practice, but because it was so decentralized, they couldn't really find it to stamp it out. So the people would just pack up the temples in their basements, and the gurus were living in people's yards anyway. And they were like being patronized by rich people. And everyone was just scattered all about. It wasn't like there was some sort of like central citadel of Hinduism that the Muslims could bomb. Right? So they never actually succeeded in really even making a dent, even though they brought the city to its knees in a more secular way. Decentralization is actually pretty effective as a defense. Yeah. So this is a quote from a modern-day practitioner of Kashmir Shaivism, what he says about Tantra. Tantric discipline is not intended to withdraw the aspirant, but to make him participate in the world of name and form, as one in identity with Shiva and Shakti. So in some traditions that we call transcendental, your idea is to withdraw from the world, or withdraw into yourself as a kind of precursor to withdrawing from the world and transcending it. In the Tantric tradition, the idea is actually to realize and be able to participate more fully in the world of name and form that we're in right now, but not participating in fully. Both bhukti, enjoyment, and mukti, liberation, are the aims of Tantric sadhana. So sadhana, sadhana, is the word that means practice. Sadhana means to go toward the goal, and of course the goal is self-realization. This is what this writer and practitioner is repeating is very often this kind of statement you will find in the ancient scriptures, that bhukti and mukti are both aims of the practice of doing sadhana, enjoyment and liberation. And why is that, oldies but goldies?
Because Shiva enjoys his creation.
Yeah. Because we are becoming more and more identified with God, with all of reality, and all of reality is in a state of divine enjoyment. So there's no sense that we're rejecting enjoyment. Mm-hmm. That's different. Yeah. Well, we do have to lose our taste for constrained and limited enjoyment and make that leap into a kind of enjoyment that isn't really easy to imagine when you're at the beginning. Yeah. But it all happens naturally. So, sadhika or sadhaka, a sadhaka is a male practitioner, a sadhika is a woman practitioner. So sadhaka and sadhika. What do you need to practice Tantra? What are the requirements? Because the requirements are not being from a certain class or caste. They're not being of any particular gender or from any particular walk of life. Right? There really aren't any of those kinds of dogmatisms in the tradition. But you must have something, or two somethings. One of them is called adhikara, and that means your original or primordial capacity, the capacity to do practice, to follow through and do consistent practice and have a desire to realize. The desire to realize is part of your adhikara. So that's what you come in with. You have a feeling for it. You are oriented toward self-realization. But then, as we all know, we can be very talented, but nonetheless spend the day lying around on the sofa drinking beer. Or whatever our, favorite thing to get lazy around is. So we may have a lot of adhikara, but we may not have what's called bhumikara. Bhumikara is, what do we do with our adhikara? There's, we know people that have lots of talent and don't really do that much with it. They may have high adhikara, but they have low bhumikara. And in the tradition it said it's better to have low adhikara and high bhumikara if you have to compromise. It's better to do a lot with a little than a little with a lot.
Is that like you're wanting to and desire and the action behind it?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Your desire, your recognition of that desire, and your ability to embody it, to put it into action, and your consistency in doing it, your clarity in doing it. Those are all aspects of adhikara. The word adi always means something like original or primordial. And you often see that as a suffix, prefix or suffix on different words. Right? These are important ideas in the tradition. So there are qualifications, and there are many stories in the tradition of teachers ruthlessly testing students to see if they have both adhikara and bhumikara. Sometimes I have had students come to me and say, why don't you, teach such and such that's very sort of general? Why do you always have to teach everything so specific to this tradition? Why don't you teach just more general stuff so that everyone can participate? And don't you want everyone to participate? And I'm like, no. I do this. This is my thing that I love, that I'm doing, and I don't do other things, right? When I wrote my first book, a publishing company wanted to publish it, a press in Berkeley called North Atlantic Press. And they're a very well-known press. I mean, they publish the Dalai Lama and I don't know who else. But they publish all spiritual books and martial arts books and like cooking books and stuff like that. And we were just about to go into contract negotiations when I got a call from my editor at the press. And the press is owned by a husband and wife team. And she said, the wife wants you to come in and have a meeting with her because she's upset that your book doesn't have more about psychology. And I was like, but I don't do psychology. That's just not what I do. And she said, well, she wants some more about psychology in there. And I said, well, I'm not coming in. You already offered me the contract. And anyway, I ended up not signing the contract. But the thing is about this tradition that although the way that I teach is way more open than this would, traditionally, a teacher would only have a few students, maybe 10 or 12 at the most, unless they were some, like, Abhinavagupta had a lot more students than that. He's the main Siddha who sort of synthesized this tradition back in the day. But mostly teachers just worked very closely one-on-one with a few students and put people through ruthless testing to see if they had the adhikar and bhumikar to do this. And of course I don't teach that way. I do teach in a more egalitarian way than that. But still there's a sense that the door opens as the student walks through the door. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's how it works. So that's still in my own teaching an echo, or I'd say a rather loud echo, of the way that this tradition was taught back in the day. There's a wonderful story that one of my Buddhist teachers told about a tradition. It's in the Kagyu tradition. The highest form of meditation that they do is called Mahamudra. And he said, when the lion of Mahamudra roars, everyone goes running in fear. But the cubs of the lion come running for the milk. I can always tell when someone is really grabbed by this tradition, by this stream of teachings. And there's a lot of people that come around. And some of them stay for some period of time and then leave. Some of them profess that they're, really, really into it, and then they leave anyway. But there's always that very special flavor when someone comes around who's a cub coming for the milk, right? It's a distinct flavor. And I don't mind. I mean, anyone can come for as long as they want and leave whenever they want. It's fine. I'm happy if anybody gets anything out of the teachings. And sometimes people come and they get what they need and they leave, and that's beautiful. That's absolutely fine. But there's always that special something when a cub shows up. So in Tantric Sadhana or Tantric practice, there are 3, what you could say, vehicles or modes of practice in general. And we go into these in great detail in the Tantra Foundations course. They have Sanskrit names, and because we're getting more into words now with people who have been around for a while, the first level of practice, which is really practiced by everybody all the time, is the conduct level. The conduct level means we're working with our bodies and with things that we can touch and pick up and see that are easy to recognize and work with, like doing asana and doing puja and doing external mantra. And this is called anavapaya in the tradition. Anavapaya. And it means anavo upaya. For those Sanskrit Greek geeks. Upaya means a technique or a means. A navo, when it gets mixed with upaya, becomes a navapaya. It means something that you do when you have, it means having a high sense of individuality. Exactly. It means that you feel highly separate. And so what do? We work with things in a dualistic way. Here's me doing my practice. Here's my little things that I'm working with on my altar, and I'm playing with all these toys, and I'm playing with my body, and I'm doing conduct practices like Ayurveda, and these are all the foundation of everybody's practice. But for some people, this is the form of practice that is the best form of practice for them in general, because they have a higher sense of separation. Mm-hmm. That is Anavapaya. Do you want to get a notebook, or you already know this?
I know I have the sheet. Has it.
Okay.
Is there going to be that sheet in the 4-day?
Yes, you're going to get plenty of sheets. The next vehicle of practice is what we call the energy vehicle. And that is called in the tradition Shaktopaya, Shaktopaya, Shakta Upaya, Shakti Upaya, working with your energy, with your Shakti. Upaya means, it's a very important tantric word. It means the means or the vehicle or the method. Method. So for instance, we can have a Satguru who's like our one and our true, the one who's like revealing our essence nature to us. Right? And then we can have Upaya gurus. Those are teachers who are wonderful. They teach us methods, but they're not the ones that are maybe showing us our essence nature in that direct way. So in our lifetimes, if we're very, very lucky, we have many Upaya teachers, and we have also other teachers or a teacher who can give us the transmission of our essence nature because of that special alchemy between you and the teacher. But not everyone is going to have that, you know. So we should honor all of our teachers, including our Upaya teachers. They're very important. So when we're doing Shaktopaya practices, we're working with our channels and our chakras, our subtle channels, the nadis. And we're doing internal pranayama, internal asana, internal puja. And then the practices with the least support. So each of these streams or vehicles, we're going from where we have the most support. I get to lean on my altar. The most things to play with, to a more subtle experience of work. We can play with our channels and chakras, but we have to be able to actually feel them and, you know, play with them. And then we're moving to another vehicle, which is where we have the least support, and that's the Anupaya. I don't know what Anu means, actually. I think Adam? Yeah. I don't know why it's called that. So there's really two levels that are called direct realization. Anupaya is considered to be like when you barely need to do any practice at all. You're already like, you've just been born like almost realized, and all that has to happen is someone just goes and you become, you know. You know, the reason why we even have Anupaya is because Abhinavagupta always liked to have like some other all-encompassing higher level than anybody else ever thought of. So, you know, for those of you that know the Tattva teaching, you know, 36 Tattvas wasn't enough for him. He had to invent a 37th. So I don't know about the Anupaya. I think that was...
It could also mean non-method.
Non-method, yeah.
Un-method.
Yeah, unmethod. But the other name, if you're slightly less enlightened than that, is Shambhavopaya. Shambhavopaya. And of course that is the same word as my name, Shambhavi. Shambhava. So that means someone who is able to remain focused on essence nature at all times, and sees no division between inside and outside, or between one thing and another. So if you are practicing at that level, you're doing Guru Yoga, non-conceptual meditation, open-eyed meditation of a certain kind, and there's some other things that you're doing, but it's very subtle. In this tradition, you get the biggest view first. In other words, you're told the whole story. And then you start your practice, and you're usually given a mix of these three different kinds of practices. It gets a little more complicated than that, and I won't get into it right now. But, you know, nobody's really doing practices of only one variety. I'm going to stop there and please ask any questions you have about anything I said or didn't say. Jayakula is a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. We are based in Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. Visit jayakula.org to explore more of our offerings.